Probably every addict of Sherlockian lore has at one time or another bemoaned the dearth of information concerning the characters who move through the tales as recounted by Dr. Watson, some to reappear, some to disappear forever. There are gentlemen, there are scoundrels, worried wives and maidens in distress, high-born aristocrats, middle-classers, and scum from the streets of London. Search as you will, it is impossible to find biographies or even minor references to these personages with whom Holmes lived and worked or tracked down, although some latter-day research has identified a character or two who, it is evident, were deliberately disguised in the texts. True, there are a few thumbnail sketches that throw a glimmer, as in the case of Lord Robert St. Simon, Colonel Sebastian Moran, Dr. James Mortimer, Dr. Huxtable of the unique given name, and Miss Irene Adler, but they are incomplete and unsatisfying. If one made an account of the personalities, aside from Watson and Holmes, who intrigued the student, we would find Mrs. Hudson, Mycroft Holmes, Lestrade, Mary Morstan, young Stamford, the Moriartys, various Violets, John Clay, and a parade of others. Really, there is little choice. Every one of them raises our curiosity, and we may know them more intimately and determine their influences on the life and actions of Holmes himself. Of all these characters, excepting perhaps Watson and Mrs. Hudson, none seems to have had more of an intimate or longer-lasting contact with Holmes than Inspector G. Lestrade of Scotland Yard. He was associated with Holmes in more recorded cases than any other member of the Metropolitan Police. That association extended from the early days of Holmes's practice, when he was located on Montague Street, to shortly before his retirement to the Sussex Downs. But even in Lestrade's case, the external records of the man are non-existent, or at best a few meagre newspaper references. The Yard files, which should be revealing, are not available for public scrutiny. The non-discriminating reading public generally regard Lestrade with a certain amount of scorn as inept and bungling. Is this a true and faithful picture? To learn what manner this man, G. Lestrade, was, we must then, in the absence of other data, turn to the saga itself. Therein is to be found a considerable fund of revealing information, not completely adequate, but sufficient to form some measure of the man. We find him active in 12 of Dr. Watson's writings, as well as a reference to him in the text of the Three Garadebs. He was one of the early callers at 221B, presumably in connection with a forgery case which got him into a fog. We may infer that he had on occasion visited Holmes at the rooms on Montague Street. From A Study in Scarlet to the disappearance of Lady Frances Carfax, a span of 20 years, we have some record of Lestrade. Of his forebears, we find no inkling, although to this writer there's some suspicion of a touch of the Gallic in his name, and in his oft-times quick actions. But the better likeness of him do not confirm this suspicion. His Christian name is unknown to us, but the only letter extant, written to Holmes after the arrest of Jim Browner, the seafarer with a penchant for severing years, is signed G. Lestrade. One can speculate on the denotation of that tantalising G from George to Gouverneur without success. There is no clue, and without a shred of evidence, I lean towards Gustav as a name that fits the subject. On his early education, there is no definitive data. That one letter is fairly well composed. A rather complete schooling without advanced study can be inferred. We know he was able to take Jefferson's Hope recital of his story in shorthand, probably following the Pitman method, since the Gregg system did not come into vogue until about 1888. As for Lestrade's age, and for some measure, for in 1881 he says the Drebber murder beats anything he had seen, and I am no chicken. Later, he admits that in spite of 20 years' experience, the sight he first witnessed at Halliday's private hotel made him feel sickish. If we make the generous assumption that he joined the Metropolitan Police at the age of 21, he would have been on high side of 40 at the time of the Drebber affair, and we know he was still active in 1903, for in September of that year he appears with a warrant for the arrest of Holy Peters. We may draw the conclusion, for all that time Lestrade was Holmes' senior by some 10 or 12 years, and served on the force for more than 40 years. At the outset, he might have pounded a beat, as did John Rance and Harry Murcher, but because of his lack of stature, it's more likely that he came up through the Records Bureau and not as a constable. By the time of the study, he had already earned a reputation, for when Holmes discusses his profession to Watson, he refers to Lestrade as a well-known detective, and Watson's account of the pending affair calls him Inspector. The newspaper at the time designate him as a well-known officer and Scotland Yard official. In 1889, the second stain, we find him an inspector with a capital in probability of indicative of first rank, but it's more likely to be a typographical digression. In the cardboard box, 1891, Holmes tells Watson that Lestrade's tenacity has brought him to the very top of Scotland Yard, which surely means that when the yard was expanded and took up its new quarters on the Thames Embankment, Lestrade came onto his own, the change in his status having been consummated while Holmes was on his hegira to Tibet and points east. Now, what of G. Lestrade's appearance? In the study, Watson described him as a little rat-faced, sallow, dark-eyed, and later as lean and ferret-like, with beady eyes not a very enticing description, but we are told he had an assurance and jauntiness that marked his demeanour and dress. Still lean and ferret-like, furtive and sly-looking, he appears in 1889, The Boscombe Valley Mystery, dressed in a light brown dust coat and leather leggings, retained by Miss Alice Turner. Some have pounced on that word retained as used by Holmes to conclude that Lestrade had gone into private practice for a period, but that judgment is not necessarily warranted, for it was not uncommon for Scotland Yarders to aid the provincial police, and Holmes's use of the word was purely controversial. We learn too, in the Boscombe Valley tragedy, that Lestrade's left foot turns in, an insignificant fact, but it does give us a clue to his gait. A few years later, in the second stain in the cardboard box, Watson is using the term bulldog features, as well as wiry, dapper, and ferret-like to describe him. And in 1897, The Hound of the Baskervilles, it is a small, wiry bulldog of a man. I am of the belief that this last phrase, along with dapper and cocky, best fits our subject. Of course, we find no photographs to confirm our ideas of Lestrade's appearance, but sketches by D.H. Friston and George Hutchinson depict him as small, so along with Watson's repeated use of the word, it must be accepted as a fact that he was not tall and will settle for a height of around 5'6" or 7. It is this lack of stature that leads one to believe he entered the service in the Records Bureau rather than the Foot Patrol. It is my personal view that the drawings of Robert Fawcett, which illustrate some of the fables published in the National Magazine in which Holmes and Lestrade appear, are the best portrayals of Lestrade in his later years, when he'd put a little bit of weight on, short, somehow paunchy, with a moustache and bushy eyebrows, a bowler on the back of his head, rather loud suit and spats, and a general cocky appearance, truly British. Any thoughts of the Gallic must be erased. What of Lestrade as a detective, as a man, and what of his attitude towards Holmes' qualities that he possessed? As a detective, we could not expect even one of the smartest of our detective officers, as the Daily Chronicle referred to him, to be in a class with Holmes, and it's apparent almost from the start that Lestrade considers Holmes as his superior, although loath to admit it even to himself. From the contempt and resentment which he showed in The Study in Scarlet, from the derision of Holmes's methods, the deductions and the inferences, we find him gradually assuming a more differential attitude. As early as 1894, the Norwood builder, he openly acknowledges Holmes' help with the yard, and in 1902, the Six Napoleons, he pays homage as a magnanimous a statement as one could hear. It is worth quoting in full, since it reveals one facet of our subject's character. Quote, "I have seen you handle a good many cases, Mr. Holmes, but I do not know that I ever saw a more workmanlike one than that. We're not jealous of you at Scotland Yard. No, sir, we are very proud of you, and if you come down tomorrow, there's not a man, from the oldest inspector to the youngest constable, who wouldn't be glad to shake you by the hand." That is not the utterance of a narrow, jealous person. Lestrade's respect may be revealed in part by the fact that in the early days, Holmes and he generally addressed each other by their bare surnames, except in occasional outbursts of sarcasm, which you can almost hear in Lestrade's "Mr. Sherlock Holmes" after his discovery of Raki, and on the leave-taking of 221B after the display of Miss Durand's articles found in the Serpentine. As time progressed, Lestrade usually used the term Mr. Holmes, with an exception now and then, as when he rebukes Holmes for what he believes is the false hopes raised by Holmes' conversation with Miss Alice Turner in the Boscombe Valley mystery. No one would be rash enough to claim that Lestrade was a brilliant theorist, but he was practical, energetic, and courageous. These qualities were frequently of help to Holmes. For an example, when Lestrade turned up the note from FHM in Hattie Doran's wedding gown, fished out of the Serpentine. Without that note, Holmes would have been without a starting point, and the very case would have been prolonged for days. And again, the discovery of the thumbprint of John Hector MacFarlane gave Holmes the clincher he needed to smoke out Jonas Oldacre. These are examples of the legwork that was characteristic of Lestrade, even though his deductions from the evidence were not always of the finest. His physical courage was never lacking, as typified in the arrests of such substantial prisoners as Jefferson Hope, Colonel Moran, and Beppo. He also stood up to Holmes and did not hesitate to point out there was a practical side to an investigation, that hard-headed British juries had to be convinced, and he believed in the hard work remark that Holmes later privately admitted had merit. Holmes himself paid unspoken tribute to Lestrade's courage when, on the return to London, he chose Lestrade as the one that would help him capture the notorious colonel in the empty house. There seems to have been a softening of feelings on both sides as the years went by. Holmes even compliments the Scotland Yarder in 1895 for his theorising as to a lack of a ticket in Cadogan West's pocket in the Bruce Partington plans. Good Lestrade, very good. One of those few times Holmes acknowledged that Lestrade was worth listening to. We learned too that Lestrade would drop in on Holmes and Watson of an evening to smoke a cigar and swap information in a friendly chat. Summarising, we picture Inspector G. Lestrade as an asset to the solution of crime in London and thereabouts, as a brave officer, an energetic, if not brilliant detective, a man ready to fight for his opinions, and equally ready to concede defeat, one who was able to give praise when due, a good legman, a friendly, human sort of person, dapper, and a bit cocky in manner, but a good solid official, always ready to perform his duty. In short, G. Lestrade was an important and influential adjunct in the life and career of Sherlock Holmes, and he deserves the respect of every student of the lore. The end. I hope you enjoyed that one. If you did, please like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode. I've been Steve. Bye bye.